Well, thank you for coming this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our city, over the past few months, has been grappling with a crisis that has seen in far too many American cities today, and that is the challenge to the trust between communities of color and law enforcement. And the breakdown of this trust can most acutely be seen since the shooting death of Mario Woods this past December. And since that disturbing incident, I have ordered a number of reforms to the police use of force policies to prevent police officer-involved shootings whenever possible. I proposed comprehensive police reforms and initiatives, many modeled after the Justice Department's own recommendations and President Obama's 21st century policing, to rebuild that community trust. I'm joined by many in our community for calling for an independent review of both our police department's policies and, of course, in the death of Mr. Mario Woods. I've asked and I've tasked Police Chief Suhr and our police commission to submit to me a detailed plan to implement further reforms after a series of community meetings around the city and with stakeholder input. This has not been an easy task by any means. And I want to say firsthand a deep gratitude I have to the volunteers of our police commission who have spent countless hours working with volunteers from our communities to make sure that this reflected desires coming from the community as well as professional ideas. And today, I accept their comprehensive reform package, which you'll hear in detail in a moment, a reform package that has been developed in partnership with our community. I have already directed my budget director to immediately incorporate these reforms into our budget planning. I believe because of the input that has been given by countless hours, again, by our African American Reform and Review Forum, and also by a number of conversations I've had, not only with this forum, but engagements throughout our communities. I believe these are substantial and meaningful changes to policy, to training, and to the equipment, and they do in fact signal a significant change in culture as to how and when officers will use force. Already, we've seen the benefits of these new tactics. Earlier this month, for example, the police department encountered a man with a knife, and the man didn't drop the knife after very clear verbal instructions, or even after getting hit with beanbags and pepper spray. Our police officers retreated in this instance to create time and distance, and they eventually were able to apprehend this suspect without having to fire their guns. Our police protecting our public safety without having to use lethal force. We are fundamentally re-engineering the way police officers use force, while at the same time increasing transparency and accountability within our San Francisco Police Department. We already have one of the most transparent and processes and open processes for governing police in the country, and this comprehensive package of police reforms will build on that foundation and help our sworn officers strengthen their ties with the community while keeping our city safe. This is a time to rebuild and build and go forward. It is a time that we recognize that we must heal the wounds and at the same time make sure that we bridge the chasms between our communities and those that are sworn to protect them. And as again, I acknowledge this is no simple task. It requires a continuous effort, a serious effort on police reform, on job training, on violence prevention, but it also has to do with education, housing, and violence reduction in our communities. I and many of the others standing behind me, representing our communities and our departments, are committed to this work, and I know everyone here as well is committed. I know that more is needed to be done and more needs to be said, and we'll continue this dialogue and this action. And I also want to make sure you know that with us today are Morgan Tucker and DeAnthony Jones. They are a couple of our youth leaders who've been part of this process, and we engaged our youth, as many as we can, along with our faith-based leaders, along with our community advisory forum that we've been working very hard at. So with that, I just wanted to let you know that this document that is presented to me today does in fact reflect what I've asked for and what I've wanted to make sure, but it also reflects an approach that I'm very proud that has been reflective of our community input. And in fact, I sat through a couple of these sessions, including the latest one last week, to make sure they were on track to present these reforms. To go into a lot more detail on this will be both our police commission and our police chief. Let me introduce Police Chief Greg Suhr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning. For years, we've been working as a police department with the community members, many assembled behind me and many more that'll end up seeing this story, to foster trust and build relationships in the community. Trust is the coin of the realm in policing. Without the trust of the community, we can't best do our jobs. That trust was shaken for many residents in San Francisco, especially those in community color, on December 2nd with the officer-involved shooting of Mario Woods. And we've been working very hard under the leadership of the mayor, Commissioner Loftus, of the police commission, to try and get to a place where we can minimize that force, especially with regard to edged weapon and other weapons situations. We needed to figure out a way to re-engineer force. We've collaborated with experts from around the country, actually around the world. We've met with people from the United Kingdom. Members from the group behind me and myself have been back east twice. The main goal in everything that we've been talking about is the sanctity of life for everybody, that everybody walks away whenever that could be possible. As the mayor stated in a story just on February 8th on 4th Street at about midnight, officers encountered a suspect of substantial size, about 6 feet, 195 pounds, with a knife in one hand and a key in the other, who would not surrender the weapons. They tried the tools that we have at our disposal. They were unsuccessful. They actually used language that we're talking about in our de-escalation practices, where they wanted to create time and distance to formulate a plan. They tried to de-escalate the situation. These are all things that we've been training to now for the last few weeks, and it paid dividends on that night as they ended up realizing that what they had was not going to work. They had to go to a plan B, and they ended up each getting an arm of the suspect and finally being able to wrestle the knife away, and again, nobody was injured. Again, sanctity of life, de-escalation, proportionality, and the need to create time and distance are the basis for everything that we're talking about with any weapon short of a firearm. The vast majorities of shootings that have happened in San Francisco by a recent study show that they happen inside of 5 minutes and inside of 15 yards. So if we can create time, 5 minutes, and distance, 15 yards, we can avoid almost all the officer-involved shootings, especially those that involve a weapon short of a firearm. We've made the pointing of a firearm a reportable use of force. It might not seem significant to the regular person, but in meeting with the community, they want an explanation every time an officer points their firearm, and they're going to get it. Supervisors are now required to respond to the scene of any weapons incident so that they can take over as soon as possible and hopefully get there inside of that 5 minutes. We changed our biannual firearms qualification to from a 1 to 2 hour, basically just competence with a firearm, to an 8-hour force options training where virtually the entire first half of the day is on everything but lethal force. We've equipped we're requiring the officers in the field now to carry their helmets, their gloves, their long batons, anything that, again, can create that time and distance. And we've doubled the amount of less lethal capacity that we have in the way of bean bags and those deployment devices over that same amount of time. We've put forth new use of force policies and proposed them to the Commission, emphasizing sanctity of life, de-escalation, and proportionality. In those policies, it prohibits an officer from using force against a person who presents only a danger to themselves, something that's been policy here but not institutionalized as permanent policy since May of 2011. It lays out the de-escalation tactics. It bans the use of carotid restraints or chokeholds, prohibits officers from shooting at vehicles where the vehicle itself is the only means of assault. And we're asking for additional tools, including training with shields. I know much has been made of the conductive energy devices. Those would only be for the SWAT teams and the specialists, and only for use when somebody is a danger to others. We've also expanded our crisis intervention team. I wish there were more members from the community that have been so helpful in that effort. We currently have around 500 officers trained in crisis intervention. Every recruit graduates the academy trained in crisis intervention. And I know that in talking to the crisis intervention trainers, we want to actually come up with advanced crisis intervention trainers, just short of hostage negotiators, that can best handle and have showed a particular aptitude to crisis intervention. With regard to building that trust, of course, there was a call for independent review, and the Department of Justice and the COPS Office Collaborative Reform Initiative is coming to San Francisco. They've already been here. We had one meeting. In looking at other reviews that were done in Las Vegas and other places, they asked for a command level personnel to be appointed. That person has been appointed. He stands behind me. Deputy Chief Tony Chaplin will head the Bureau of Professional Standards and Principal Policing, and he'll speak in a minute on those subjects. For transparency and accurate data and technology, something else that the community is calling for, we're going to be collecting data in real time using our web-based data warehouse and smartphones that the officers have been issued to be able to process our tickets, detentions, and field interviews over time that we believe will come in ahead of both the Assembly bill and Supervisor Cohen's bill, hoping to improve data transparency. Of course, body cameras are coming. We hope to have the first body cameras hung in early summer, maybe sooner, with everyone in the San Francisco Police Department that works the street being equipped with a body-worn camera by the end of 2016. We have also opted into the White House Open Data Initiative, where we are now additionally posting public information on that website with regard to arrests, demographics within the department, and on, so that regardless if there's a disparity in those numbers, they're transparently posted, and we're working to address any disparities. We've tried to identify and improve cultural competency in the department. Many people have seen the Not on My Watch campaign, where officers, both sworn and civilian in the department, have taken an oath to try and search out bias and speak to it, both inside the department and outside the department. All officers will receive training in procedural justice and implicit bias by the end of the year. We are partnering with community leaders, some of them behind me, that will actually be instructors in those trainings. And the district level captains will work directly with leaders in the respective communities to identify hotspots, and we're identifying senior officers knowledgeable of those neighborhoods to resolve conflicts where people might have neighbors in their community that might need special attention. We're doing everything we can to recruit a diverse workforce. It's critical that the San Francisco Police Department look like San Francisco. For the first time pretty much ever, we have a 24/7, 365-day application process, whereas it wasn't that long ago when there was a 2-week window to apply to be a San Francisco police officer. Now, pretty much anybody can go online and apply around the clock. We are also engaging with City College to have an 8-hour accredited course that help people figure out what they need to do to become San Francisco police officers. And members of my African American Community Relations Forum have actually designed a workshop where we have identified any barriers to entry, again, to try and get people to a place where they can become San Francisco police officers. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Commissioner Loftus to speak a little bit more to what we're doing with regard to policy and introduce Deputy Chief Chaplain. Commissioner.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chief Suhr, Mayor Lee. Thank you, Reverend Brown, Cheryl Davis, so many city leaders who are here, community partners. On December 9th of last year, a week after the officer-involved shooting of Mario Woods, the Police Commission convened and heard speaker after speaker express anger, frustration, grief, and sadness at what they saw in the video of the officer-involved shooting of Mario Woods. Now, I'll say this again, and I've said it before, there are 3 separate investigations that are ongoing into the actual shooting, and they must be thorough and complete. The Commission, however, would not wait for them to conclude before opening a discussion of the policies and procedures being used regarding use of force by the San Francisco Police Department. We committed to joining the national effort to fundamentally re-engineer the way police officers use force. Since then, we've been meeting in small groups, large groups, at the Police Commission and beyond to work collaboratively with community members, subject matter experts, and commissioners to chart a path forward. A lot of what the chief said is true. We're borrowing concepts from the Police Executive Research Forum. We're borrowing concepts from the President's 21st Century on Task Force on 21st Century Policing. But it has to fit San Francisco. In order to rebuild trust, it's a relationship, and it requires all parties at the table. And the thing that I'm most proud of in this effort is that the words on this paper and the path that we charted forward, 10 headings, 30 sub-bullets, are actually the result of conversations that happened in communities across San Francisco about what is it going to take to rebuild this relationship of trust. In particular, I want to thank the young people from our Community Safety Initiative who facilitated these discussions. If you were there, you saw these were tough conversations, and they were led by young people, predominantly who live in our public housing in San Francisco, who led the conversations with grace and a real commitment to make things better. I'd like to thank all of the community members who've participated in a forum, the Chief's African American Advisory Forum, to those who've spoken out at Police Commission meetings, written to us, or even come up to myself and my fellow commissioners at the supermarket. We have heard you, all of you, loud and clear. As a result of all of these conversations, suggestions, and discussions, we have 10 areas of focus as we move forward. And it comes down to this. Regardless of zip code, everyone deserves to have a relationship of trust with the police. This plan recognizes that while there are countless neighborhoods across San Francisco where the police and community enjoy that relationship, there are many where that relationship has been damaged. And the mayor has acknowledged that today and directed us to work on rebuilding that relationship. It will require everyone. As the chief has laid out, there are 10 areas. I invite community members, police officers, advocates, join us as we move forward. First, as the chief indicated, re-engineering use of force. The commission has asked the department to redo the policies around use of force. In this process, what we've learned, if we can train officers with the skills, equipment, and tools needed to create time and distance with suspects armed with a knife, we can see a reduction of up to 80% fewer officer-involved shootings. As the chief indicated, most officer-involved shootings happen within minutes of that patrol officer responding to the scene. So the focus here is, if we put that patrol officer at the center of our discussion, that person might be on the job for 5 years or less, might be under 30 years of age. The question we're asking is, does that officer have all the training, skills, and equipment needed to create time and distance in a very stressful situation? Can they create a reaction gap, a safe perimeter? Can they buy time to allow a senior officer to arrive, someone who's crisis intervention trained, to further slow things down and preserve life? At the heart of the policy that is being considered now is sanctity of life. Every decision that we will train that officer to make is around preserving the sanctity of life. In addition, the Commission has convened a group of diverse stakeholders to review the policy the department came up with, and the United States Department of Justice Collaborative Reform Initiative has also agreed to review the policy. The next area of focus, accountability and leadership. You'll hear from Deputy Chief Tony Chaplin, who will be leading these efforts. The Commission has also asked for independent staff to support our policy initiatives. Data and transparency is the next focus on our path forward. The Commission has directed the Department to commission a study to disaggregate the data on disparities in arrest rates. Specifically, we need to better understand the cause behind the gaping disparities, in particular in the African American community with arrest rates, so we can do better to close that gap. The Chief indicated body-worn cameras has been a priority of the Department and the Commission, and we do believe in 2016 all officers will be armed with body cameras. The next area of focus is eliminating bias and cultural competency. Reverend Brown will talk about this. Reverend Brown has often said, it's sometimes a matter of common sense, but sometimes it's not. It's actually understanding the community that you are sworn to serve. Training on procedural justice and implicit bias will be enacted. We will have a community partnership to create the cultural competency training that Reverend Brown has discussed. We will expand the early intervention system, and this came up at community forums. How do we identify officers who are struggling before they have gone too far? We will expand that system and make sure it works. The next area of focus, investing in community safety initiatives. Cheryl Davis will talk about the partnership we had this summer with young people, predominantly from public housing, who came in and gave us recommendations on how to rebuild this relationship of trust. What we all know about a relationship of trust is that it takes work. So one of the areas of focus is a sustained effort to recruit young people to continue to work with us to identify ways that we can do better. The Chief talked about recruiting a diverse workforce. He also talked about recommendations from Obama's 21st Century Policing Report. And the last three things that I will mention are this. When we did have these meetings in the community, we also evaluated them. So there was a survey at the end. How effective do you think this was? Do you think this worked? What we heard back loud and clear was, this was great. We love that you asked our opinion. But there was some skepticism about whether or not the ideas were actually going to turn into action. As a result of that, we have committed to establishing an academic partnership with an institution that we will find to actually evaluate the efficacy of this plan. Plenty of times plans are rolled out, but the commitment to actually evaluate it, live or die with the results, will allow us to hold ourselves accountable. It will allow the community to hold the Commission accountable. It will allow the Commission to hold the Police Department accountable. Finally, two last things came up that are outside the scope exactly of the Police Department but bared addressing. One is, community member after community member addressed with us, if we don't have a meaningful public health response that really addresses the reality that violence destroys communities, and in certain communities in San Francisco, without intervention, we oftentimes will have a 6-year-old who may have witnessed 3 homicides. And what the community members told us is, we do want to work with the police department. We want you to improve your procedures. We also want a shared response, a public health response in the communities most impacted by violence, so that we can actually intercede, intervene in the cycle of violence, and create safe and healthy communities for everyone. And finally, we have asked the mayor for support in identifying additional resources to allow us to certify additional police officers with different foreign languages that they speak. That's another critical piece at building trust. And so that is the final recommendation that we have made. And I will just say, as we move forward in further implementing these proposals, let us remember, as the mayor indicated, that we have one of the most open and transparent processes for governing police in this country. My invitation is, let's use it together to make sure our city lives up to its values. Thank you. And it's my job to introduce Deputy Chief Chaplin.
Thank you, Commissioner. The mission of the new bureau that's being created in the San Francisco Police Department will be to contribute to excellence in law enforcement by increasing professionalism and maintaining high levels of accountability within the San Francisco Police Department through the use of the DOJ's findings. This new bureau was created by Chief Suhr as a commitment to review current policies and practices, analyze and implement changes necessary to bring the San Francisco Police Department into the 21st century of policing. A major component of that will be the COPS DOJ Collaborative Reform Review process. That review will allow us to take a good hard look at ourselves and show us what's good and what's not working. With that being said, President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing had 58 recommendations and 91 action items included in the 2015 report. The department agrees with, has implemented, and or will implement all recommendation or action items directly related to law enforcement. One of the main points we will focus on is devoting additional resources to focus exclusively on unsolved homicides in San Francisco's neighborhoods most impacted by violence. We are committed to taking all of the DOJ recommendations and implementing them. The review process is a 2-year process, but we will not wait for its completion. We intend to begin implementation immediately during the review process itself. This way, as issues or deficiencies are identified, they can be corrected. At the request of the mayor, the police department will create a dashboard available on our website to monitor the progress of the implementation of the task force recommendations in keeping with the transparency and accountability of the San Francisco Police Department. This is a challenging undertaking because this is a bureau that has never before existed. This will be new territory for an old and proud department. We will have some issues pushing change to some. To them, I say, what we are doing will be for the good of the city and county, the department, and most importantly, the people we serve. The fact the chief is dedicating a deputy chief and an entire bureau to this undertaking is evidence of the San Francisco Police Department's commitment to improve how we do things. This new bureau will add units that are already in existence as part of the SFPD reorganization. These units are the Youth Community Engagement Unit, which will give us access to reaching out to the community, specifically the proactive way the unit collaborates with members of the public and the department. YCE is responsible for the critical task of opening up the lines of communication between the police and the community to build better rapport and trust. The second unit is the BSU, the Behavioral Science Unit. This piece will allow us the ability to modify and continue the CIT certification and training needed for dealing with people with altered mental states. This is an important piece in achieving the goal of 100% CIT certification in our members. This will give our officers an additional tool to create time and distance in terrible situations. The third and final unit is the Written Directives Unit, which is responsible for facilitating the review, development, and publication of department policies, manuals, and forms. This component will be the delivery method to push change and directives out to the entire department. While San Francisco has seen measurable drops in our violent crimes like shootings and homicides, we have seen some fraying of community trust that has to be mended. Part of that mending will be more community involvement in our day-to-day operations and how we do things. With that, I will close my introduction to the newly formed Professional Standards and Principal Policing Bureau with a reminder to all that police are the public and the public are the police. And with that, I turn it over to Reverend Brown.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Chaplain. Mr. Mayor, I should like to first commend you for responding to the appeal that came from the womb of the African American community. That appeal was that we should, in times of crisis and tragedy, not turn on each other, but turn to each other. And because we turn to each other, in this city of St. Francis, we have really created a dream team, a team that has been referenced in terms of personages and personalities who came together. Secondly, as a history buff, I want to make sure that there be no redacting on this matter, that we would set the record straight. Chief Greg Suhr, 20 months ago, assembled in the Assembly Hall of the historic Third Baptist Church with his command staff. And at that time, in the wake, in the fallout of Staten Island, Ferguson, and many other communities where there have been unfortunate expressions of the loss of life and violence, Chief Suhr responded to the call of the NAACP that we would get involved in a deliberative, focused, intentional endeavor to make sure that San Francisco would not be a replication of what had happened in other areas of the country. However, unfortunately, in the midst of our process, we lost the life of one Mario Woods. We again were confronted with a parent grieving, a community disturbed, and some folks are getting on the defensive rather than coming together. And before I end my remarks, I want to say that I am issuing now a respectful, loving, and common sense appeal to the San Francisco Police Officers Association to come to the table, come to the room. Let's sit down and talk. We are not your enemy. We are your friends. We're with you when you're right, and we're still with you when you're wrong to make sure that you get right. I do not feel that it is disrespectful to make this comment at this time, but the NAACP has unsuccessfully reached out to the Police Officers Association, who put up a firewall rather than to see all humankind as being members of the family of our Maker, and that people tend to hate each other because they do not know each other. They do not know each other because of a lack of communication. It's time, I repeat, that the Police Officers Association join this dream team and agree to disagree without being disagreeable. I pledge to you, our dream team, that the NAACP will be looking, will be watching to make sure that these plans, these words, will not ring hollow, but we are going to, in the words of Nike, just do the right thing. We must move beyond truth-telling, meetings, and engage in encounters of reconciliation. We are on our way. we're going to hold our hope and not let go until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness in this police department and this community will overflow as a great moving mighty stream. And now I present to you Ms. Cheryl Davis, and as she comes, let me acknowledge that the moral compass of this dream team is very much expanded, strengthened, and shines brightly. But we have here in the room Rabbis Jonathan and Beth Singer of Temple Emmanuel Congregation, who represent the interfaith community, who are standing with the mayor, with the chief, with all people of goodwill and justice.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. As Reverend Brown made his appeal to the POA, I worked with community, and our appeal was to young people and to make sure that the voices of community were included. And so I want to thank the chief and President Loftus and the mayor for providing that space. I also first want to acknowledge and thank the people that were willing to host these conversations, to take the risk, to convene, and to be in a space where they invited people to come in and share. So the Bayview Y, Turf, Be Magic, I see Sean in the back. I know that they helped to rally some folks there. Bodecker Park, Boys and Girls Club, and the Tenderloin, Reverend Brown and Third Baptist, which hosted the first workshop and convening, and the Human Rights Commission. I see Veronica here. Those were some hard conversations to have and to begin. And I want to acknowledge, I know DeAnthony Jones is here and Morgan Tucker. DeAnthony grew up, born and raised in the Western Addition in a couple of different public housing developments. Morgan's roots run deep in the Bayview Hunters Point. And these young people led and facilitated these workshops. They broke out, they managed the breakout groups, and they managed the hard conversations. And the conversations were hard because they were critical. This was not a come and sit and let's talk about how great San Francisco and the police department is. This was a come and let's talk about what needs to change and how do we go about changing it. I want to acknowledge some of the other folks who aren't here today, Michael and Ifani and Daniel, African-American young men, Jeremiah, who led these workshops, who were challenged with facilitating conversations with adults. I love to go to the story about Jeremiah where we had a man who was getting very upset and agitated and was escalating, and his voice was getting louder and louder. And Jeremiah, one of the young people, went over to talk to him. And I don't know what he said. And the man sat down and started laughing. And I asked him later, Jeremiah, what did you say? What happened? How were you able to kind of calm the moment? And he said that he had the pins on. He had all these pins on his shirt, and he asked him, you know, one of the pins had a quote from Maya Angelou, and he asked him, what do you think Maya Angelou would think of what you're doing right now? And said the man laughed and thought, you know, she wouldn't be very happy, and he sat down and calmed himself and re-engaged in the conversation. Those who attended the workshops and the information sessions appreciated the space to talk, to be heard, and respected the youth who facilitated the conversations. It provided an opportunity for young African-American youth who are most likely to be impacted. A lot of times we talk about these conversations and we're doing this work, and we forget the voice of the folks who are most inclined to be impacted by the conversation. And it allowed them to have voice, to lead the conversation, to be a part of it. There were 4 sessions led by youth across the city. And then in addition, I want to also recognize that this wasn't reactive. These young people had been convening conversations since the summer. There had also been 3 community forums. They have interviewed hundreds of people across this city. They made 2 different documentary movies where they talked about how people feel about the police and how to change that. The space provided a place for honest critique and shared skepticism. As President Loftus mentioned, people are very concerned that these will be more conversations that go nowhere. And so we are hoping that today really is not symbolic of moving forward, but that there will be some movement that happens. Some may disagree, but I would argue that this is a national model to see how engaging with young people and giving voice to young people and giving voice to community can shift the dynamic. To take the recommendations from community and actually implement them, we can actually see the paradigm shift. I want to also acknowledge that many of the young people that we worked with are criminal justice involved. They have been on probation or off probation, and so for them to come in and lead these conversations, to be in a room with the police officers, is huge. And to also feel like the police officers hear what they're saying. Reverend Brown mentioned this idea of coming together and reconciliation. This was about humanizing on both sides. The young people got to see the police officers as human, community got to see these young people as human, and the police officers also got to see everyone else as human. We are hoping this is the beginning of more conversations, not the end, and especially with being led by young people from the communities that are most impacted. A comprehensive approach that empowers the most impacted by the failing system. I just think that we can't stress enough the idea and the notion that we actually engage community in the process to define how things can improve is the only way that we're going to actually move to improvement. And so I really want to thank the mayor, the chief, the president of the police commission for at least making the effort, and time will tell if we're able to move it forward, but I believe based on what's already transpired that we're looking at a very promising and hopeful future.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Reverend Brown. Thank you, Deputy Chief Chaplain. Thank you to the Chief and to President Loftus. They will be here along with the others to go into depth on the package of reforms that we have committed to, and it begins with the budget, but I assure you, Cheryl and everyone else, we will follow through on every single one of these. As the Commission has done a lot of work with the community, folks, we have to honor that. And our youth will know whether, in fact, we keep our word by the very fact that we honor it by implementing these changes. These are not going to be easy, and this is what I'm getting everybody ready for, is that the change will come. It will affect all the officers. It will affect all the training. It will affect the way we hire, the way we talk, the way we communicate. And certainly, the incidences we already are seeing are dramatic. And we know of others, and you're welcome to talk with the chief about other instances that have already shown the results of these changes taking place with the officers and the crisis response teams themselves. With that, I'll open up to a couple of questions, and then please, I invite you to follow up with the individuals. Yes, ma'am, and Mike. Yes.
You said that you're going to add this to your budget planning. Could you tell me what you're going to add? Is it more training, as you said? What about the tasers, crisis intervention? Do you have a money figure?
We don't have a total amount. We've already, what I've gotten is this document is being reviewed now with the police chief and the Commissioner Loftus, with Kate Howard, my budget director. And while we're just in the beginning of the budget, we have cost factors for all of these that will be implemented. And as I said earlier, too, we're adding this to what I had already been committing to, because I've got a very robust IPO program. That is the Interrupt Predictive Policing and the community organizing that has been successful over the past few years in reducing the number of homicides, but there's certain areas of our city that we have yet to reduce that dramatically. And this is where I challenge the community-based violence reduction program leaders to take this opportunity and come in with us and see what can work even more. But we're in a good trend, but we have to do more. In education, there is more than ideas. There are implementing ideas that we want to have reflected in the budget. The community-based violence reduction programs are key, but also so is Recreation and Park Department in making sure that we have a spring and summer where the kids can be very active because idleness will not help. And in education, we're always trying to produce alternatives to traditional education which doesn't reach all of our kids. And I believe that we have a very good conversation going right now in both public and private resources that hopefully can be aimed at the health crisis in our African American community, because as was stated earlier, the traumatization of kids who see this over and over again. We cannot dismiss that as being simply a scientific laboratory experiment. This is happening in real life, and it affects kids going to school, the people that we don't want to drop out. They're feeling this trauma. If we can reduce that and make sure we have healthy environments for our kids to learn in, that takes a lot of coordination and collaboration. That's why I say this is not an easy task. It takes everybody, and the euphemism about being a village, well, it's true, because everybody has to work at higher levels in order to get a better result. Mark? Well, again, and here's where I will accept the criticism about being very deliberately slow in talking about tasers, because I did not want, out of respect for all of our community's input, we do not believe tasers is the Panasonic, is really the answer to reducing violence. We do not believe that. That is a truth here. It is one tool. It can be valuable in certain circumstances. But time and distance, retraining, backing off, having other alternatives are more than being studied. They're actually being implemented. And this is why I want you to talk with the chief about other things that we have done that show real good, life-saving results. Mark?
Reverend Brown talked about getting the POA to join in. The POA in their radio spots complained about politicism. They complained about the board voting unanimously for Mario Edwin. Could you respond to that?
Well, I think Reverend Brown will respond to it. Let me add, we respect the POA and the officers' need to be represented. But like we said, on these crisis situations, we have to come together. We have to figure it out. And we have to go forward not accusing each other of having different viewpoints, but having a commitment to an overall goal of reducing violence in the city. And like we said, the POA is does have a very important role in rebuilding trust. And this is what we're all trying to do with the collaboration that we have. Reverend Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The great British cleric said, "No man or woman is an island unto himself or herself. Never send to ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." Now, it's unfortunate that the POA took issue. A life was lost. That should have been us all. We are all part of the human family. And I hope that they would rethink their position. The board members were expressing sympathy and support for the mother. That was not to condone the actions of this young man at all. And I think that what we are doing as this team would indeed stop this unnecessary force that destroys human life. And I hope we will not focus also on tasers. It's about trust. It's about police officers getting to know the community getting to know police officers, and our working together as a team. And I want to acknowledge the presence of Sean Richards, who's put his life in harm's way, trying to be a voice of reason out in the community in the midst of this great tragedy. And let the word go forth. We're simply saying to the Police Officers Association, don't relate to us through the press. Come and sit down and talk with us as we've sat down and talked with each other over these 20 months.
One last question, and then I'll offer you the opportunity to talk with everybody. Phil.
Over the weekend, a young man was gunned down
Yeah.
at the police station. What kind of message is that?
Well, First of all, let me say this: every life that's lost is a very big tragedy, and while that is under investigation, I want to appeal and join our commissioners and our police department and community members. We have to reduce violence. The circumstances here call for our community to come forth with any information that they might have in order to assist us in making sure that the individual or more who are responsible are held accountable for this. It is brazen. It's happening in a neighborhood that we are embraced with trying to change it for the better. And we have a lot of challenges in the Fillmore. And this is obviously a tragedy. And this represents, again, the reason why we have to keep a very strong group of people working together to prevent these tragedies, getting guns out of the hands of folks that obviously are going to misuse them, making sure that people have a way to resolve their differences without shooting each other, and making sure we hold those individuals accountable. And again, it's a young person. A 20-year-old is a victim here. And how many times have we seen that happen? And we've got to work even more concertedly to prevent that from happening. With that, I invite everybody to follow up with our members of our community. Again, thank you, everyone, for being here.